No contact, powerful as it is, still leaves an avoidant with something to hold on to, something their mind can quietly return to and interpret. Evidence that they still occupy real estate somewhere in another person's ongoing story. There's a considerably worse experience waiting on the other side of that silence, one that doesn't announce itself with the same clarity, one that most people never even realize they're capable of inflicting simply by living their life forward. It isn't anger, it isn't distance. It's the complete, quiet disappearance of an avoidant from someone else's internal narrative, the moment they stop being a reference point entirely, stop getting brought up in conversation, stop functioning as a comparison, a memory, a story anyone tells anymore. Not forgotten in the sense of having stopped mattering once. Forgotten in the considerably more devastating sense of no longer occupying any space in the story of someone's ongoing life at all. What follows is an explanation of why this specific kind of erasure lands with a weight that no contact alone rarely manages to reach, why it activates something in avoidant psychology considerably deeper and more destabilizing than ordinary silence, and what this reveals about the actual underlying architecture of what an avoidant fears most, which turns out to have very little to do with losing a person and everything to do with losing their place inside that person's continuing story. Anyone listening who has genuinely reached the point of no longer bringing up an ex-partner, no longer referencing them in conversation, no longer comparing new experiences or new people back to them, not because of any deliberate effort to avoid the topic, but simply because they've genuinely stopped occupying that kind of space, deserves to understand exactly what that milestone represents and why it tends to matter more than almost anything achieved through deliberate silence alone. It's worth naming, before going further, why this particular distinction between deliberate silence and genuine narrative erasure deserves such careful, dedicated examination rather than being treated as simply a more extreme version of no contact. These two experiences operate according to fundamentally different mechanisms, one requiring ongoing, active effort to sustain, the other emerging entirely without effort as a natural consequence of genuine, complete healing. Treating them as points along the same continuum, simply differing in intensity, obscures something important about how differently they actually function, both in what they require from the person experiencing them and in what they ultimately communicate to anyone eventually discovering them from the outside. To understand why this specific kind of erasure carries such devastating weight, it helps to examine what no contact actually preserves, even while it disrupts a relationship's usual rhythm. No contact, however complete and however sustained, still requires active maintenance, a deliberate, ongoing choice not to reach out, not to check in, not to respond. This active maintenance, paradoxically, keeps the other person present in an ongoing, functional way, present enough to require this kind of deliberate, continuous restraint. An avoidant sensing this kind of silence, even when they can't directly observe the restraint being exercised on the other side of it, often intuits correctly that something active is still happening, some ongoing decisions still being made, moment to moment, not to re-engage. This means no contact, despite its considerable psychological power already explored elsewhere, still implicitly confirms the avoidant's continued relevance, their continued presence within an active, ongoing decision-making process happening inside someone else's mind. It's worth naming why this implicit confirmation, however uncomfortable, still functions as a kind of psychological anchor for an avoidant navigating the aftermath of a relationship's ending. Even negative or uncomfortable confirmation of one's own significance tends to feel more tolerable, psychologically, than genuine uncertainty or genuine confirmation of insignificance. This is why no contact, despite being experienced as painful and destabilizing, still doesn't produce the specific, more totalizing distress being described throughout this exploration. It confirms significance simply through an uncomfortable, restrictive channel rather than confirming the far more threatening possibility that significance itself, in any form, positive or negative, no longer exists at all. This confirmation, uncomfortable as it might be, still offers something for an avoidance psychology to hold on to, evidence that they remain significant enough to require this kind of deliberate, ongoing management. The erasure being described throughout this exploration operates according to an entirely different mechanism because it doesn't require any deliberate restraint or ongoing decision-making at all. It's worth naming why this distinction, effort versus effortlessness, matters so much more than it might initially seem to, because it touches something fundamental about how humans generally interpret significance within relationships. Effort, even the effort required to maintain silence, still signals active engagement, a continued expenditure of psychological resources oriented around another person's presence or absence. The complete absence of that effort signals something categorically different, not simply reduced engagement, but the genuine cessation of any need for engagement at all, a distinction that tends to register, for anyone eventually discovering it, as considerably more final and considerably more complete than any amount of silence, however prolonged, could ever manage to communicate on its own. It reflects something structurally different, the natural, effortless consequence of someone having genuinely, completely moved into a new chapter of their life, one where the avoidant simply doesn't arise anymore, not because they're being deliberately excluded or avoided, but because they've stopped being relevant enough to arise naturally in the first place. This distinction between deliberate restraint and genuine, effortless irrelevance is precisely what makes this particular experience so much more devastating than no contact alone, because it removes even the strange, backwards comfort of being someone whose absence requires active management. There's a metaphor worth holding here. Picture someone who has spent years believing themselves to be a significant character in a particular story, important enough that the story's other characters would need to actively work around their absence if that absence were ever to occur, requiring careful narrative adjustment, ongoing acknowledgement of the gap they'd leave behind. Then imagine this same person discovering considerably later that the story has simply continued forward without any such adjustment at all, that their absence created no gap requiring careful narrative management, because the story's actual center of gravity was never really oriented around them to the degree they'd always assumed. This discovery isn't just disappointing. It's a genuine confrontation with having misjudged one's own significance within a story they believed they occupied a central, load-bearing role within. This is close to what an avoidant experiences upon discovering, often accidentally and considerably later than they might expect, that they've become genuinely, effortlessly irrelevant within someone else's ongoing life and ongoing narrative, no longer requiring deliberate avoidance or deliberate silence, simply because they've stopped being significant enough to require any deliberate management at all. It's worth naming exactly how this kind of discovery tends to happen, because it rarely announces itself directly, and understanding its typical pathway helps explain why it often lands with such disproportionate force once it finally occurs. It helps to describe a few specific, recognizable forms this erasure tends to take, because the abstract concept of no longer being referenced can be difficult to picture concretely without something more specific attached to it. One common form involves how someone discusses their own relationship history with new partners or new friends, whether a former avoidant partner gets mentioned as part of that history at all, or whether the story of one's own past simply skips over that chapter, not through deliberate omission, but because it genuinely doesn't feel relevant enough to include when the broader narrative of one's own life gets told to someone new. Another common form involves the absence of comparison during new relationships specifically, whether new partners' behaviors, qualities, or ways of expressing affection get measured, even briefly or unconsciously, against the previous avoidant partner, or whether new relationships simply get evaluated entirely on their own terms, without any need to reference what came before as a point of comparison. This particular form tends to be one of the more telling indicators of genuine erasure, since ongoing comparison, even subtle and infrequent, tends to indicate that the previous relationship still occupies some active, ongoing reference point within one's evaluative framework for new experiences. A further form involves how questions about past relationships get answered when they arise naturally in conversation, whether a former avoidant partner gets described with specific, detailed memory and emotional texture, or whether they've genuinely faded into something closer to a vague, general outline, remembered as having existed without carrying the same vivid, specific emotional weight they once carried. This particular form tends to develop more gradually than the others, and its presence, when it does eventually appear, often surprises the person experiencing it, since vivid emotional memories rarely feel, from the inside, like they're actually fading until enough time has passed to make that fading genuinely undeniable. A final form worth naming involves the absence of any residual, habitual behaviours that once orbited around the relationship's existence, checking for updates, noticing anniversaries or significant dates, experiencing any lingering curiosity about the ex-partner's current life or circumstances. The genuine absence of all these habitual behaviours, not through deliberate suppression but through authentic disinterest, tends to be one of the clearest, most concrete markers that erasure has genuinely, completely occurred, rather than simply being managed through ongoing, effortful avoidance. This discovery often happens through some indirect, incidental channel learning through a mutual acquaintance or some other second-hand source, that a former partner hasn't mentioned them in ages, that conversations about dating history or past relationships simply don't include them anymore, that they've genuinely stopped functioning as a reference point in the ordinary, unremarkable way people usually continue referencing even relatively minor past relationships for years afterward. This kind of discovery tends to arrive without warning, often at a moment when the avoidant themselves has been assuming on some unconscious level that their continued significance was simply an established, ongoing fact requiring no verification. Learning otherwise, often through some accidental second-hand piece of information, rather than through any direct confrontation, tends to produce a particular kind of disorientation, distinct from the more acute panic explored in other examinations of avoidant reactions to loss. This disorientation carries a quieter, more existentially unsettling quality, less about losing something actively contested, and more about discovering that something assumed to be permanently secure was never actually as secure as it seemed. There's something important worth naming here regarding why this specific kind of erasure activates such a deep, particular fear within avoidant psychology, considerably deeper than the fear of ordinary rejection or ordinary loss already explored elsewhere. There's a deeper psychological grounding worth explaining here as well, because it helps clarify why narrative inclusion specifically, rather than simply emotional memory, carries such disproportionate weight within human psychology generally, not simply within avoidant psychology in particular. Humans generally construct their sense of identity and significance substantially through ongoing narrative, the stories they tell about their own lives, the people and events they include as meaningful chapters within that ongoing story. Being included as a chapter within someone else's ongoing narrative functions as a kind of confirmation of having existed meaningfully within their life, considerably more significant in terms of confirming genuine impact than simply having been emotionally significant during the period the relationship was actually active. This explains why narrative exclusion, being genuinely dropped from someone's ongoing story rather than simply ceasing to be actively loved by them, tends to activate such a deep, almost existential kind of distress. It isn't simply about no longer being loved, which, painful as that already is, at least confirms having been significant enough to require an ending worth remembering and discussing. Narrative exclusion suggests something more totalizing, that the relationship itself has been reclassified as insignificant enough not to warrant ongoing inclusion in the story of someone's life at all, a considerably more severe kind of erasure than simply no longer being loved. For avoidants specifically, given their already heightened foundational fear regarding their own fundamental significance and necessity, already discussed throughout this exploration, this particular kind of narrative exclusion tends to be experienced with unusual intensity, precisely because it confirms, more directly and more completely than almost any other available signal, the exact fear their entire psychological architecture has been organized around avoiding confirmation of for their entire adult life. Avoidants, as discussed throughout other examinations of this topic, tend to carry a persistent, often unconscious terror of being fundamentally unnecessary, replaceable, forgettable, someone whose absence changes nothing meaningful in the lives of people who once claimed to love them. This fear operates as one of the deepest, most foundational anxieties underneath almost all avoidant defensive behavior, considerably more foundational than the more commonly discussed fear of engulfment or loss of independence. The erasure being described throughout this exploration represents the single most direct, most undeniable confirmation available of exactly this deepest fear. It isn't simply evidence that someone has moved on emotionally, which, as explored elsewhere, can still coexist with genuine, ongoing significance within that person's broader life narrative. It's evidence of something more totalizing, that the avoidant has genuinely stopped mattering enough to even occupy space in ordinary conversation, ordinary comparison, ordinary reflection on one's own relational history. This confirmation doesn't simply hurt. It directly, unambiguously validates the single deepest anxiety an avoidant's entire psychology has been organized around avoiding confirmation of for their entire life. It's worth being precise about what distinguishes this specific kind of erasure from ordinary, gradual forgetting that occurs in any relationship over enough time. Because the distinction matters considerably for understanding why this particular pattern carries such disproportionate weight. Ordinary forgetting tends to happen gradually, accompanied by the natural, expected softening of memory that occurs with any past relationship over a long enough period. And it doesn't typically involve complete erasure, so much as a kind of gentle fading into the general, unremarkable category of past history. The erasure being described throughout this exploration carries a different, more specific quality, often occurring considerably faster than this kind of natural fading would predict, and often involving something closer to complete removal from active reference and comparison, rather than simple, gradual softening. This faster, more complete quality tends to be what makes this specific pattern so much more devastating than ordinary time-based forgetting, because it suggests something more deliberate underneath the apparent effortlessness. Not deliberate exclusion exactly, but a kind of genuine, rapid reprioritization that reflects just how quickly and how completely someone has managed to build a new life, a new set of reference points that simply don't require ongoing comparison back to what came before. There's something worth validating clearly here for anyone listening who has achieved exactly this kind of genuine, effortless erasure, who has noticed, perhaps with some surprise, that an ex-partner simply doesn't arise anymore, in conversation, in comparison, in the ordinary reflective moments where past relationships often continue getting referenced for years. This achievement, if it can even be called that, since it likely wasn't pursued deliberately as a goal, represents something genuinely significant. A level of complete, integrated healing that goes considerably beyond simply managing to stop actively missing someone. It reflects a genuine restructuring of one's own internal narrative, one where the past relationship has been fully metabolized rather than simply managed or avoided. There's an important caution worth naming here as well, because everything explored throughout this piece could easily be misapplied if treated as encouragement to deliberately, performatively erase a former partner from conversation and memory as a kind of spiteful strategy, rather than allowing this milestone to develop naturally as an authentic byproduct of genuine healing. Deliberately, consciously working to avoid ever mentioning an ex-partner, refusing to discuss them even when they arise naturally and relevantly in conversation, treating their exclusion from one's own narrative as a point of pride or a demonstration of having moved on successfully, represents something considerably different from the genuine, unforced erasure this exploration has been describing throughout, and it tends to produce a noticeably different underlying quality, however similar it might look from the outside. This distinction matters because deliberate, performed erasure still requires ongoing, active management, precisely the same kind of effortful maintenance already discussed as characteristic of no contact rather than genuine erasure. Someone deliberately avoiding any mention of a past relationship is still, in a very real sense, actively managing that relationship's presence in their life, simply through avoidance and omission rather than through active reference. This deliberate management tends to keep the past relationship considerably more present and considerably more emotionally charged than genuine, effortless forgetting ever does, precisely because active avoidance requires ongoing awareness of exactly what's being avoided. Genuine erasure, by contrast, doesn't involve any particular effort to avoid mentioning a past relationship. It simply doesn't require mentioning because it genuinely doesn't arise as relevant anymore, the same way most people don't spend energy deliberately avoiding mention of, say, a minor acquaintance from many years earlier, not through effortful avoidance, but through genuine natural irrelevance that requires no ongoing management at all. Recognizing this distinction matters for anyone trying to assess honestly whether they've actually reached this milestone or whether they've simply developed a considerably more effortful, considerably less complete version of it that still requires ongoing active maintenance to sustain. It's important here to address something that deserves direct, careful attention as well, because this same caution applies to the possibility of forcing this kind of erasure, deliberately, actively working to remove an ex-partner from conversation and comparison, specifically in order to produce this particular devastating effect. This would represent a significant misapplication of everything being explored here. The erasure described throughout this exploration works precisely because it's genuine and unforced, the natural byproduct of a life that has moved forward so completely that active reference simply isn't required anymore. This distinction matters enormously, both because avoidants, as discussed in other explorations of this topic, tend to be reasonably capable of eventually sensing the difference between genuine, effortless disappearance and its deliberately performed counterpart, and because building an entire approach to healing around producing a specific effect in an ex-partner, even an effect as seemingly satisfying as this particular kind of devastation, tends to keep someone's own healing process oriented outward toward managing someone else's eventual reaction, rather than genuinely, fully oriented inward toward the actual, complete metabolizing of the past relationship this exploration has been describing throughout. There's something worth exploring further because it addresses a specific practical question that naturally follows from everything discussed so far, whether it's actually possible to know, with any confidence, that this kind of complete erasure has genuinely occurred, given that its entire nature involves an absence of deliberate, observable action rather than any specific, trackable behavior. This is worth naming honestly because the answer involves recognizing that this milestone tends to be identified more clearly in retrospect than in the moment it's actually happening. Genuine erasure isn't something someone consciously monitors or tracks while it's occurring, precisely because monitoring it would itself represent a form of ongoing reference and attention that contradicts the very quality being described. Instead, this milestone tends to be recognized only once someone notices, almost by surprise, that a considerable amount of time has passed without the ex-partner arising naturally in thought, conversation, or comparison. A noticing that happens after the fact rather than through any deliberate, ongoing tracking. This retrospective quality is actually one of the more reliable indicators that genuine erasure, rather than effortful, deliberate suppression, has actually occurred. Deliberate suppression tends to require ongoing, conscious awareness of what's being suppressed, which paradoxically keeps the suppressed content more present and more trackable than genuine, effortless forgetting ever does. The very fact that genuine erasure tends to be noticed only in retrospect, through surprise rather than through deliberate monitoring, is itself evidence that it reflects real, complete healing rather than effortful, ongoing management. For anyone listening who worries that they haven't yet achieved this particular milestone, who still finds an ex-partner arising in thought or comparison more frequently than they'd like, there's something important worth offering here, without any accompanying shame or urgency. This milestone isn't something that can be rushed or forced through willpower, and its absence doesn't indicate failure or inadequate healing. It simply indicates that the process is still ongoing, following its own timeline, one that varies enormously depending on the relationship's specific history, its duration, its intensity, and countless other factors entirely outside anyone's direct control. Comparing one's own timeline to some imagined ideal pace at which this erasure should occur tends to introduce exactly the kind of anxious self-monitoring that actually works against the natural, unforced process this milestone ultimately requires. There's something crucial worth naming here as well, something that deserves careful, honest treatment rather than being glossed over in favour of a tidier conclusion. Achieving genuine erasure, in the sense being described throughout this exploration, doesn't necessarily mean the past relationship is remembered negatively, or that genuine appreciation for whatever good existed within it has been erased alongside the more active, ongoing reference and comparison. It's entirely possible to hold a generally positive, settled perspective on a past relationship, while simultaneously no longer actively referencing or comparing current experiences back to it. Genuine erasure, in this specific context, refers to the absence of active, ongoing reference and comparison, not to the erasure of memory or appreciation itself. These are two genuinely separate things, and conflating them risks producing an inaccurate, overly negative picture of what healthy, complete healing actually involves. There's something worth addressing directly here as well, because it speaks to a specific, common question that naturally follows from everything discussed so far: whether an avoidance eventual discovery of this kind of erasure, whenever and however it happens, tends to produce any lasting, meaningful change, or whether it simply produces temporary, acute distress that eventually fades without altering anything about their underlying patterns going forward. The honest answer, consistent with everything explored in other examinations of avoidant psychology, resists a simple, satisfying prediction in either direction. This kind of discovery can, in some cases, produce genuine, lasting reckoning, precisely because it confronts an avoidant with such an undeniable, direct confirmation of their deepest fear that continued avoidance of the underlying issue becomes considerably harder to sustain. In other cases, it simply produces temporary distress that eventually settles once enough time passes, without producing any lasting shift in the underlying patterns that created the need for this kind of confrontation in the first place. There's no reliable way to predict from the outside which outcome a particular avoidant will ultimately move toward, and building expectations too firmly around either possibility tends to produce unnecessary disappointment or unwarranted hope, depending on which direction those expectations happen to lean. What can be said with more confidence is that this discovery, whatever its ultimate effect on the avoidant experiencing it, offers genuine, valuable confirmation regarding something that likely mattered a great deal throughout the relationship's entire history. That the presence and significance being withdrawn was real enough and significant enough that its complete, effortless absence would eventually register as this specific, distinctive kind of devastation, considerably more profound than ordinary silence or ordinary distance ever could produce on their own.